The People Puzzle, co-sponsored by the Cleveland Children's Museum and the National Conference of Christians and Jews, is about the human family, the human experience, their similarities and their differences. It can be said that the whole world lives in every community. So it can also be said that community must recognize that it is an inseparable part of the whole. This program is about the issues that the People Puzzle addresses. The same issues we face every day: prejudice and stereotyping. Children need to recognize the difference between bias and truth, and to develop a moral strength to deal with others as individuals. As adults, we must teach children how to work toward a fair and peaceful society. Diversity is a positive aspect of human life, as children become familiar with a variety of backgrounds and a complex society. Though habits and customs may differ, the human family must care for one another. In Cleveland, something special is happening. The whole community is focusing on the rewards and challenges of diversity. We need to sort it all out, to work together to develop our own moral strengths. The best way to overcome barriers is to start with our youngest and help them learn to put the puzzle together. I invite you to listen to our experts, to participate with both your heart and mind, and to use these relevant discussions wherever you are to move forward together.
Those powerful words, spoken so eloquently by Barbara Jordan, form the basis for this program. Hello, I'm Lee Fisher, the Attorney General of Ohio. Stay tuned as we explore and probe into the important issue of prejudice on the People Puzzle teleconference next.
The People Puzzle teleconference is a joint project of the Cleveland Children's Museum and the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And now, here's the moderator for the program, Ohio Attorney General Lee Fisher.
Welcome to the People Puzzle teleconference. It's a community discussion on prejudice and its impact on children. We welcome all of you watching from sites around the country. The goal of this teleconference is to encourage you to take personal and community responsibility for the impact of prejudice on children. People are in different places on this journey, and it's a lifelong pursuit. It's our hope that this program will help each of you move forward with your own action plan to explore the issue of prejudice. I'll be posing real-life questions and situations to a very distinguished group of people. Let me introduce them to you now. First is William Atwood. Bill develops and implements a comprehensive Head Start program in Cuyahoga County in Cleveland, Ohio. Next is Professor Sally Wertheim. Sally is a trainer of teachers, and she cares about what happens to the children in the classroom. Next is Ed Sivak. Ed is a senior at St. Ignatius High School, and he's involved in Delta Omega, which is the multicultural club affiliated with the National Conference of Christians and Jews, and we'll refer to them often in this program as NCCJ. Next is Cynthia Triplett. Cynthia has been an advocate for parents and their role with the schools and at home. She's a youth outreach worker at League Park Neighborhood Center in Cleveland, and she's on the Cleveland Board of Education. Next is Dr. Donald Freedheim. Don has been president of Early Childhood Options of University Circle in Cleveland, and he's had impact locally and nationally with specialties in retardation in children, pediatric psychology, and the abilities of disadvantaged children. Next on our panel is Billy Osborne. Billy's been involved in services for child care and early education, and she's been involved in the social service arena for 15 years. Next is Dr. David Rue. David has been a leader in the Korean American community, and his professional areas of interest include culture, ethnicity, and psychiatry, anxiety disorders, depression, suicide, and eating disorders. Next on our panel is Stephanie Tubbs-Jones. Now, Stephanie is the Cuyahoga County prosecutor, and she previously served as a judge on both the common pleas and municipal courts, and has seen the impact of prejudice on self-esteem from yet another perspective. Next on our panel is Nikki Williams. Nikki is a sophomore at Beechwood High School, and she's involved in the NCCJ-sponsored Multicultural Club. Next is Myrna Villanueva. Myrna heads an agency which focuses on the educational needs of Hispanics. She's taught in the Cleveland Public Schools. Sitting next to Myrna is George Herbeck. George has been an advocate of many family and community causes over many years. He advises a youth development center and is pastor of Calvary Lutheran Church. And last but certainly not least on our panel is Darlene Bailey. Darlene has headed the community committee which led to this teleconference, and she teaches those who work with the children in the organizations and centers and the neighborhoods. She serves on the board of the Heights Youth Center. As shown in the beginning of the program, the People Puzzle is a joint project. The National Conference of Christians and Jews is a civic organization without religious affiliation, which focuses on proactive programming dealing with issues of prejudice and discrimination based on race, religion, culture, ethnicity, and gender. NCCJ provides customized diversity training for schools and businesses and municipalities and community groups, as well as a human relations program for high school students, community workshops, and collaborative projects such as the People Puzzle. Now, the Cleveland Children's Museum is more than just a museum. It's an activity center offering room-sized, hands-on theme exhibits plus a variety of daily programs. About 100,000 people come each year. The museum is a learning lab for schools, for churches, camps, and scouts. With a record of 15 different exhibits over a span of 7 years, the Cleveland Children's Museum invites all children and their families to be inspired to become lifelong learners. And the People Puzzle is one of the 4 current exhibits at the Cleveland Children's Museum. It opened in October of 1992. The exhibit addresses how people of all kinds are unique and valuable, and how they fit together. Activities include analyzing and drawing your own face, exploring and comparing family cultures, connecting to diversity and culture through music and dance, and exploring prejudice and stereotypes through interactive video. Also, we have a message board and becoming a roving reporter and exploring relationships through puppetry. We're going to begin our discussion with the topic, what is prejudice? And to give us a good understanding of prejudice is Dr. Robert Coles. Robert Coles is a renowned child psychiatrist and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and has spent most of his 30-year career listening to children. Through his Children of Crisis series and his books on the moral, political, and spiritual life of children, he's illuminated the hardships and the hopes and the dreams of children from many cultures and classes. And while in Cleveland at the Children's Museum People Puzzle, Dr. Coles talked with children and adults about how we can all help children grow up in a diverse world.
Well, it's not natural to have prejudices. It's certainly natural to notice the difference between ourselves and others. By the time we're even 2 or 3 years old, we begin to distinguish different appearances, different skin color, just the world and all of its contours and variations and subtleties. That is natural. That is what in psychology is called cognitive awareness, which grows in children and all of us over the years. Prejudice is something else. Prejudice is the use of the normal observations that we all make in a way that places value judgments on what we observe, good or bad, distasteful, pleasant, desirable, undesirable. That is where prejudice and discrimination, in the pejorative sense of the word discrimination, begins to take root. Prejudice is the acquisition of negative attitudes toward others based on the learning we acquire in a particular neighborhood or in a particular home setting, or however it is that we acquire these negative impressions of other people. That's what prejudice is, and unfortunately, it is to be found all over the world.
Well, it's time now to turn to our panel and ask some questions. And I want to begin with Dr. Donald Friedheim, who's the professor of psychology at Case Western Reserve. Don, my first question is it natural for a child to have prejudice? Is it learned or is it automatic? And is prejudice always bad?
I think it is not natural. As the song that Rogers wrote some time ago, you've got to be taught. And children learn by living in our culture, unfortunately, that people of different skin color, people who look differently, live differently, they behave differently, and if you just let them observe and grow in this world, particularly in the American culture, without actively countering what they see, they're going to be prejudiced because they're going to see suffering in certain parts of our world and people living in luxury in other parts, and develop through that learning, as Dr. Cole said, this cognitive awareness that there are differences, and that these differences are associated with people that are in stress or people that are live in greater luxury. So it is not natural, but it's something that they learn as they just grow up in our culture.
Billy Osborne, you deal with children every day in child care centers around this town. You're the director of Starting Point. When a child sees a difference, they see another child with a different color of skin, they see the differences. They're not necessarily colorblind. At what point do you start talking to your child and explaining to them what it is that they're seeing?
Well, first of all, immediately. I think that children need to know as they're growing up that there are different people in the world. Everybody's different. They learn that there are different colors, there are different shapes, so this is nothing new to them. They become very curious, but I think that it's important for educators to tell children, and parents as well, that all human beings are basically equal. They have the right to certain things in life, but do not go into a lot of details. But you should begin to talk about the differences of people, not the differences of prejudice or anything like that, but just that people are different.
Nikki Williams, you're a student, you're a young African-American woman. Have you ever experienced prejudice, and when did you know what it was?
Well, I've experienced prejudice many times. When I was probably in 3rd grade, I think was the first time, and one of the boys wouldn't let me play in their Foursquare game, and they said, "Get out of here, you nigger!" And it made a really big impression in my mind, and but I just decided that I wasn't going to become prejudiced towards any other race, because I feel everybody is equal.
Cynthia Triplett, your daughter, Nikki, comes home and tells you she's just been called a word like Nikki just described. What do you say to your child?
The only way I can respond to that is to say that I really believe, like Billy pointed out, if these things are pointed out when they're at a very young age, I think it eliminates the possibilities of it being so dramatic when our young people are exposed to situations like that when they're Nikki's age. I personally believe that as they're growing up, pointing out the sameness in people as opposed to pointing out the differences. I found it working with a lot of young children, they don't really notice the differences, more or less. I point out the sameness, that people are people regardless of where they come from.
Bill Atwood. A lot of people who came to America years ago from Europe were told that America is the melting pot. Cynthia's talked about sameness. She talked about differences. Is America the melting pot, or is it the tossed salad? Because they're not necessarily the same thing.
Right. I don't think America is really lived up to the myth or the conception of being a melting pot. I think what America is basically the tossed salad, I would say. And I think we need to recognize that. I think maybe sometimes it's not good that we all fit into one certain mold as a melting pot. I think it's good that we have differences and diversities in our community. I think the problem is when we start looking at someone and punishing them or penalizing them or being prejudiced because they're different. I think so. Again, I would say America is not the melting pot.
We'll come back to that, but now let's hear from some students from the Urban Community School who have something to say about prejudice.
Prejudice is when someone doesn't like someone because of reason, like
skin colors.
Yeah, and differences. Like if someone didn't like someone because they didn't wear Nikes, that would be prejudice, but not. That would be a dumb. That is one of the dumbest prejudice.
If like two people don't like each other and then you want to be somebody's friend and they don't want to be your friend because you're a different color or religion or someone else's friend that's that color.
A person of a different race or color than another notices that one of this other different people of color or race is doing something that they don't like. They might take it out on all people of that race or color.
Let's go to Darlene Bailey. Darlene, what if your child never brings up the issue of prejudice? Do you bring it up?
It's a very good question. Some people believe that if you bring something up, you're introducing it, and therefore it becomes most figural in the way that they do life. I'd rather err on the side of preparing my child, not overdoing it, as Billy said earlier, not making a big deal about it, but letting my child know that there are differences and that unfortunately sometimes people attribute difference to negativism, difference to bad, difference to wrong. So yes, I would one day when I'm blessed with a child, would like to be able to say that there are prejudices, and prejudices based on fear. So be yourself and let people get to know you.
Stephanie Tubbs-Jones, you're more than a public official, you're a mother, and I happen to know a very proud mother. How do you teach your child to be proud of his heritage, but at the same time to appreciate the differences in others and not to become prejudiced against others who don't look or act like he is?
I think you teach your children to be proud of their heritage by giving them access to their heritage. A lot of people, I think that's one of the issues that's come up in education, is whether or not, I remember being a child in school and I read books in the system, and I don't ever recall seeing a face as pretty as mine. And I used to wonder, as I read through those books, why there wasn't a person of color in some of the books. And I think that what you need to do is expose your children to people much like they are, their history, their dynamics, so they understand from whence they come, and then as well expose them to other persons. And that's the richness of having children together of different cultures, because they grow and learn together about one another, and they learn to appreciate their differences, and then they learn to appreciate their sameness, but they're proud, their self-confidence is built, and that's what you have to build in your child, the self-confidence that no matter where they go, they can be proud of themselves, they can be strong about themselves and say, here I am, accept me, or get out of my way, one or the other.
I hear you. Now, there are a lot of children, Dr. Rue, and parents of children watching this program right now. They might be confused because what we have to say doesn't apply to every child and every age. Is there an age when it's too early to begin talking about this, and is there an age when it's too late to start?
Good question. The way I look at children, the earlier, the younger they are, the impact of a prejudice or any kind of hurt feelings will be greater. So as soon as a child experiences a prejudice and then therefore feels slighted and hurt, I think that's a time to recognize it and talk about it. So I don't know what exactly age would be the perfect, but old enough to know the difference and be able to talk about it, and that's the age.
Ed Spivak, you're a student. Now you are white, it's sometimes also referred to as Caucasian. Have you ever experienced prejudice?
Yes, I have experienced prejudice.
What kind of prejudice? You just want me to ask that follow-up question, didn't you? Testing me to see if I'm listening, and I am. Go ahead.
At my school where I go, I'm in this multicultural club, and it's got sort of a label. It's not really, even though it's called multicultural, people think it's just for blacks. And I've gotten involved with it because I grew up in Cleveland Heights, which is pretty diverse, and Ignatius isn't that diverse. So the prejudice I experienced was from the side of other white kids saying, why are you in that, what's the point? It's just for black people.
That's very interesting. Now let's move to the woman sitting next to you because she teaches teachers. Sally Wertheim, you teach teachers. Right now the word multicultural is very in society. But there are some families that don't experience a multicultural world. Everyone in their community is Hispanic, or everyone in their community is white, everyone in their community is black. To them, multicultural really doesn't mean anything. Should every parent have multicultural dolls? Should we always be teaching multicultural issues in school if it's not relevant to those students?
I think that every parent would certainly want to expose their children to the kind of community that we live in. Cleveland is a multicultural city. In fact, it's a wonderful example of all the different cultures that we have, and that's why we have things like the exhibit at the Children's Museum, seriously, so that people can, if they're living in a very homogeneous kind of setting, or their children go to a school where they really just see other children like themselves, I think they want to provide opportunities for their children and for themselves to really experience other kinds of people, because that adds a lot of richness to their lives, and it's another opportunity to learn. And I think teachers want to do this, and that's why now when we're educating teachers, that's an important part of the curriculum, is teaching them about the different cultures and having them experience them really on their own. Because when you experience them firsthand, that's when you really begin to appreciate and value them.
We're going to come back to you and the rest of the panel, but I want to go now to the next area of our discussion. And that is, should parents and teachers bring up prejudice? And to provide us with some background on this issue is Dr. Patricia Ramsey. Dr. Ramsey is an associate professor at Mount Holyoke College. She's recognized as a national expert in the area of multicultural education in preschool settings. And one of the first references for the People Puzzle exhibit was her book, Teaching and Learning in a Diverse World. She recently visited the People Puzzle exhibit and worked with some people who are leading community discussions for this program. Now our next topic.
The question about whether or not we should raise the question of prejudice, I think is an interesting one, because a lot of times people feel that we shouldn't be even mentioning issues like race or social class because maybe the children don't notice. There's a sort of hope that children are colorblind and they don't notice differences, which of course is wrong. They do notice differences and they're thinking about it. So it's not really even a matter of a teacher or a parent having to raise the issue. It's really allowing those questions to come up. And they very quickly come up if you have dolls representing different racial groups, if you have books that represent people from different socioeconomic classes and different racial groups and different cultural groups, those questions will come up. And then what the teacher or parent can learn at that point is what is the child's what are the child's questions? What is the child thinking about those issues? The children often spontaneously express stereotypes, images, and then the teacher has something to go with. And they say, okay, these children are assuming that these people are poor because they're bad. So then the teacher can directly confront that with stories, with discussions, and help the children unlearn that particular assumption.
Okay, now I've got a question for George Herbeck. George, you tell your child that it's important that he or she be exposed to all different kinds of people. And then one day your child says to you, but Daddy, all your friends look alike. Why can't my friends look the same way? What do you say?
Well, thankfully, I've never had to say that to my child, because all of my friends have not looked alike.
Probably that question isn't relevant to anybody on this panel, but let's pretend.
But I think that I might approach that by saying that I would like my child to have a richer and more fuller life than I've had, and that I've probably been culturally deprived, and I don't want my child to experience the same kind of cultural deprivation. I think I would say to my child that one of the ways that I've been conditioned in this particular culture and society is that my own sense of worth had to be built on the backs of others by downgrading others, and I certainly don't want you to feel that you have to build your own sense of self-esteem and worth on the backs of others, that you have intrinsic self-worth, you have some gifts to share, but we live interdependently in this community and in this world, And the only way your life is going to be as rich as it can be is by being open to receive the rich gifts that others have to offer.
Lee, I think another appropriate response to a child in that instance would be that your exposure in your life is going to be a lot different than mine, in light of the fact that we are dealing in a world where we can go around the world in half a day, and that we're having children have interchange in different countries and different worlds, that you have to be exposed more than I was. And so therefore, in order for you to compete out here and to be successful in a world that is predicted to be predominantly minority by the year 2000, 2100, that you've got to be prepared. And if you don't have the exposure, you won't be prepared, and you're going to be out the mix.
And the fastest growing minority in America, last time I checked, was the Hispanic population. Myrna Villanueva, there are many different ways that you can discriminate against someone else. It can be religion, it can be color of the skin, sometimes it can also be language. And there are many young Hispanic and Latino children who are learning to live in a bilingual world. What do you say to a child who's being made fun of because of the way they speak, not necessarily because of the way they look?
Good question. First of all, I think it's important to note that Hispanics haven't cornered the market in language, and that there are many other cultures that also have different languages. As a parent, I would hope that they would instill very young in their child's life that they've taught them in the only way that they knew, and it happened to be a language other than English, which happens to be Spanish. I think that's real important for a young child to know that they are different, and yet that they, because they are different, that they have something that they can also contribute. And I think it's as easy as pointing out things in the house and naming them in different languages. It's also an opportunity for a young child to teach someone else something that they know something different, and that they can contribute, and they can teach their friends that other language.
I want to go back to an issue that we've all touched on earlier, and Billy, I'm going to start with you, Billy Osborne, and that is, we live in a world that is as diverse as it is. Many people have a tendency to have friends that look like them and talk like them and are of similar backgrounds. How do you expose a child to diversity if they're growing up in a world that is not really as diverse as we all think it is?
Well, if you're in Cleveland, you have an opportunity to do just that at the Children's Museum, because at any given time you will have all different types of folks coming through.
Children's Museum is thrilled you're saying that. Okay, that's good.
In addition to that, we also have other types of organizations and programs that are available. The library has different groups. I mean, we have so many different types of programs that are going on right now that have a mix. There is no excuse, if you live in a town as rich as Cleveland, for a parent to not expose their children to a multicultural setting. In addition to that, there are plenty of books on the market. Everybody's into the videos, and there are lots of resources out there that parents can get their hands on, that they can begin to view with their children and begin to discuss things with their children, so that they know that they live in a mixed world. You can take a ride on the RTA, which is the bus, our public bus system, and at any given time you can see people of all colors, all cultures. I mean, we're rich here.
Cynthia Triplett, you're on the Board of Education. Is this something we should be teaching children only at home, or can we teach them in the classrooms too?
It definitely has to be taught in the classroom. However, I'm a firm believer that the parent is definitely the first educator, and parents have to know the differences of prejudice and stereotyping themselves so that they can pass on to their children how to live in this world, really, with everyone else.
But isn't that imposing one set of values that should only be imposed at home and not in the schools? This is a very controversial thing in America today, and that is, my set of values may not be your set of values. So are we saying that we should assume that everyone should not be prejudiced, and we will teach that in our schools? Sally Wertheim, what do we say to that?
You know, it's not a new thing at all, Lee. I mean, this was one of the issues that faced the people who really began the whole public school movement. How do you teach morals and values without teaching a particular set, or my values, as you say? And I think that that we've been able to do that. That there are some givens that probably all of us agree that children should know about. And I think that they're taught all the time. They're taught in the ways that teachers act with children. They're taught in the modeling that goes on in classrooms. So that there's the real curriculum, and then there's what, you know, we educators call the hidden curriculum. And therefore, I think you're much better off to be conscious about what it is you want to teach. There are many curricula available today that teachers can use to teach these, quote, values. And I think that that it's an issue, but I don't think it's an issue that we have difficulty overcoming. We do it all the time. I mean, we're teaching values in whatever we do, so we may as well recognize it and talk about it and do it in a conscious way.
For some reason, every time you talk, Sally, someone in my ear tells me to go and go to the next segment. It must be coincidence and nothing else. I know all of you want to join in, but I got to go to the next segment. We'll be back. We'll be back. How do you teach young children to accept others and not to discriminate? Well, that's a tough question. Children do learn about prejudice, but it's the adults who need help in knowing what to do in specific situations.
I think that young children learn about prejudice, bias, they learn about other people the same way they learn about anything else. And the kinds of information that they find meaningful, the kinds of information they remember, their reactions are all the same that they would be about anything else that they would be learning. And that's something that's very important for us to remember when we're talking to children, is that it still has to be on their level. That we can't give them great long lectures about discrimination and expect a 4-year-old to really understand that. Young children, preschool children, will be mostly apt to notice physical differences, and they may be curious. That curiosity can turn into fear if what they get back from adults is a fearful reaction. So, for instance, if a child is walking with a parent through a neighborhood that's unfamiliar, the child notices people look differently than they do. The child might ask some questions. If the parent at that point grabs the child's hand tighter and sort of walks off more quickly, then that child has learned, this is something I'm afraid of. If, however, the parent squats down, talks to the child, yes, people are all speaking a different language, this is something that's interesting, let's go into the store, maybe we can buy something, but it makes it an interesting, exciting experience for the child, they'll learn something positive. But it's on a very concrete level. It's not the time for the parent to launch into great discussions about you shouldn't ask those questions, or everybody's created equally. It's really a time to address it at a very concrete level.
Stephanie, you wanted to say something earlier. Go ahead.
I was talking about, in response to the question, what do you do to expose your child to cultural diversity? Seems like in our society, in our life, we're always looking for somebody to give us a program or send me somewhere to do this. It's very easy to find a coworker in your employment who has children who may be of a different race or different religion, and say, well, let's, on this particular day, let us go out to dinner together. Will you come over to my house? I'll go over to your house, and let's begin to expose our families, because kids gauge us through our actions, not through things that we sit down and talk to them about. If they see that we act in a prejudiced manner against someone, they're going to act like that because they believe that they're mimicking what we're doing, unless we've taught them in a different manner. And I think that's an easy way, other than going out to look for a program to handle it.
The only problem with that, Stephanie, and I'm going to go to Bill Atwood for this one, is that children don't just learn from their parents. They don't just learn from their teachers. They learn from each other. And when they're at that neighborhood center, there's no parent around. There's no teacher around. How do you unlearn stereotypes that you've learned from your own parents?
Okay. Lee, my approach is a holistic approach. I think in the centers that I work with, we try to deal with the children, the teacher, and the parent. As one of the members stated, we recognize the parent as the primary teacher of that child. But what we try to do is to bring together an educational program for the parent and the child and the teacher, where they're all working together to deal with certain problems and certain prejudice and whatever. I think, again, it was stated that we should start very early. We start around 3 years old with the children that we have. In our classrooms, we have different cultures, pictures of different cultures and different experiences that the children go through. Field trips, we take them on different field trips around the city to expose them to different cultures and different experiences and stuff. So I think it's a holistic approach. You have to deal with the parent, the teacher, and the child in a holistic setting.
Okay, now Ed, how old are you?
I'm 17.
You ever remember any time All those years growing up, any teacher ever talking to you about this?
Let's see.
And this is not a long program. We don't got a lot of time. Okay. Can you think of any teacher, any time?
I can.
Okay, go ahead.
I can remember my sophomore year in a morality class. We touched on
Morality
prejudice.
class?
Yeah, well, it's religion and it's morality.
Okay.
It's theology and it's morality. We
Okay.
took it for a semester.
Nikki, what about you?
Well, I've never had this person as a teacher, but definitely Dr. Bain has helped me a lot. His multicultural club, and it's just, he explains a lot about the different races, and we're able to discuss what our differences between the different races and our feelings and opinions, and we're able to usually come to a common solution about some of the things that go on at school.
Lee, I think the point here is that the parent and a teacher have to be really actively involved in helping children with prejudice. You know, it's interesting, we don't wait for a child to ask to learn to read or to learn to study math. At the appropriate time we say, now you must learn this. And I think that parents have to do that when it comes to teaching human values also. Now we must learn to counter what would be, as you say, sort of natural prejudice that surround us. There's something else I want to say also. You know, prejudice really is fostered by situations in which there's low self-esteem and anger and feelings of deprivation and feelings of hurt. And the very first job of a parent is to help that child feel good about themselves. It's been indicated in some of the discussion we've had. But if a child feels good about themselves, then they don't need to feel that they're better than someone else. And that's what prejudice really feeds on. It's sort of the need that people have if they feel very, very different and lower than someone else.
I want to encourage all our panelists to follow the lead of Stephanie and Don and interrupt me anytime you want. I don't consider it rude, because if you want something to say, just say it. You don't even have to raise your hand. I may cut you off too, but that's all right. Now, Darlene, I don't think we often focus enough on the fact that there are really two victims of prejudice. If I call you a name, you're a victim. But aren't I a victim too? The person who is committing the prejudice sometimes is also experiencing pain. Talk to us about that.
Well, very much so. It's very much a relationship of mutuality, obviously, in the concept of relationship. Someone that thinks so little of themselves as to attribute negativity, the difference, to be something very negative unto someone else, is speaking very clearly about their own fears, as you mentioned earlier, their own apprehensions, concerns about their own limitations, concerns about losing something to someone else. So it's very much a loud voice given to the fact that that person feels deprived in some sense as well as the person that they're casting the aspersion upon.
There's something here that I don't understand, Dr. Ruin. I know you want to speak anyway, so this is a perfect time to ask you a question. And that is this. For the last 10 years in all of our schools, we've been teaching children to be strong, to be self-confident, to protect themselves, and to be wary of strangers. But I'm hearing all of us tonight that we need to be accepting of people who are different, accepting of people that we don't know. Those are two very confusing messages to a child. On one hand, beware of the stranger. On the other hand, that stranger may be somebody who doesn't look like you, but they may be nice. What do you tell the child?
As a child psychiatrist, I really run into a lot of situations where the parents consciously train children to be suspicious of strangers, and your point is well taken. It really hurts me to see that, because that child will constantly, throughout his life, look upon children, I'm now a stranger, and immediately have a negative notions about it. And I think there is a certain truth to teaching children to be cautious, but a blanket stereotyping all strangers or people who are not looking alike just categorically as being bad, which is the basis of discrimination and prejudice. I think that's what we are talking about. But while I'm talking, I want to go back to what Darlene said and George Herbeck said earlier. You started asking Darlene about, isn't it bad for the discriminator as well as person who is prejudiced or discriminated against?
Yes.
In terms of overall scheme of things, and I think that's the important point. George spoke earlier eloquently how he doesn't want to have his children grow up thinking or taking advantage of a system of something like somebody else's back. I think there's a lingering a moral issue here if we do not address this system that basically give the advantage to a certain group. And the member of the group will constantly feel like I am someone on some kind of welfare role. And that, I think, really works on the person's morality, a sense of self-esteem, and in the end, I think that's more detrimental if we don't do something about. And I think this program is good for everyone, not just a person who is discriminated against.
The little man in my ear tells me that I've got to go and do one more thing, and I'll be back, because I can always tell when George and Stephanie want to speak. What do you tell a child who experiences prejudice? Children are very clear about the pain of prejudice. In fact, the pain can be on the part of those who are prejudiced and those who are the target of prejudice, as we just heard from Dr. David Rue.
What makes people feel prejudiced is when, like, say I was walking down the street and Carrie came up and pushed me down, and I asked her why she did it, and then she said because you're black, then that would be prejudice. That would make me feel that she's prejudiced.
Once when I lived on 45th, there was a couple of white guys. They said they didn't like Puerto Ricans because they're rowdy and stuff. And then one time they tried to start a fight. Nothing really. And they just tried to push me around and stuff for a while. I lived there. When I moved.
Well, children do experience pain from prejudice, and of course this is always a tragedy whenever pain of this kind is experienced. But let me point out that out of such pain and suffering, there sometimes can be enormous growth. Children who go through such pain based on prejudicial comments made toward them or even actions taken toward them, those children are learning an enormous amount about the human condition. It's a high price they're paying, but it's a kind of knowledge that's terribly important, and it's a kind of knowledge that really introduces them, how would Tolstoy put it, into the world of pain and suffering and tragedy. And all I can say is we have to reach out to such children, we have to hold them close to us, reassure them, offer them our love, offer them our understanding, and very important, we have to learn from those children. We have to let them be our teachers, because what they have gone through, we can go through, and what they have gone through ought to give us pause about ourselves and anyone else, because what they have gone through is a terribly important aspect of what human beings the world over go through.
Okay, George Herbeck, you're a pastor at a church in real life, among other things. A young boy comes to you and says, somebody just called me an absolutely awful name. And he's more than just in pain. He's anger. He wants to thrash out. He wants to retaliate. He wants to exact revenge. What do you say to a child?
I'm not sure what I would say to him in that situation. It might depend upon a number of circumstances. I think what I want to do is exactly what Dr. Cole said initially. I really want to be able to listen to that young person. I'd want to give that young person an opportunity to vent all of their frustration and their anger. And I think that I probably would not at that time respond with a lot of words. I think I would want to do exactly what Dr. Cole said. I think I'd want to put my arm around that young person and give that some person assurance. I want to give them a different experience in terms of their encounter with another human being.
Myrna, I have to ask you a quick question and have to ask you to give a quick answer because we're running out of time. Your child is upset, and it's because the other child has called him a name. Do you call the other child's parent, or do you have that child deal with the other child?
I think I'd keep it close to home. I'd want to deal with my own child and try to go through what my child is experiencing, as opposed to maybe taking it to another step at that point. I'd want to just hear what my child is feeling and maybe give some moral support in that sense. Much like what George would say, it's really hard to tell.
Now, we've been exploring prejudice and its impact on children. Now it's your turn to ask us what's on your mind. But before we hear from you, let's watch a segment again from Barbara Jordan. We saw this at the beginning of the program, and it's worth seeing again.
Children need to recognize the difference between bias and truth, and to develop a moral strength to deal with others as individuals. As adults, we must teach children how to work toward a fair and peaceful society. Diversity is a positive aspect of human life, as children become familiar with a variety of backgrounds and a complex society. Though habits and customs may differ, the human family must care for one another.
Well, now we're going to go to questions from our studio audience, from people around Cleveland, and for that matter, from people around the country. We're going to start with our studio audience, and Barbara Patterson, you got the first question. Go to it.
Is it useful, panel, to address prejudice when one encounters it in adults, friends or relatives, for example? And if so, could you give some specific ways of doing that?
Okay, I'm going to direct that question to the panel since you didn't mention any specific person. Cynthia, let's start with you. I think, as I understand Barbara's question, she's saying you know somebody else who's prejudiced. Maybe they're not prejudiced against you, but you know they're prejudiced. Do you raise the subject with them, and how do you raise it?
I run into that situation often because I work with a large, diverse group of people, and when I run into it, the only way I know how to deal with it is as honest as I can, as honest as I feel the other person could be. And if they admit that they are prejudiced, we sit and we talk about it and hopefully get them to look at themselves.
Now, what if another child's coming over to your house to play with your child and the other child's being prejudiced? Do you say something to the other child, or you say it to their parent?
Yes, I do. I talk to the child. I talk to the child. Sometimes you cannot reach parents per se, but a lot of times I found that you can talk to that child and build up that trust with that child so they will come back, if nothing else, because they know they found a positive manner.
Okay. Anybody want to follow up on that? If not, let's go to our next question, and I'm going to read it to you. This is from all the way from Kansas City, so you ought to be impressed. The question from Kansas City is, how do you infuse the people puzzle curriculum into the schools? I have no idea. Sally, tell us how to do it.
In 3 easy words, right? I think you have to really start with the teachers and work with the teachers around understanding and talking about the curriculum so that they can then take the curriculum into their own classroom and make it theirs. You can't just hand it to them. They have to really work it through and make it theirs and then bring it into the classroom. And I think the word infuse is a good word, because that's what you really want to do. You don't want to just attach it as another kind of thing that they're doing. Rather, you want them to be able to really infuse it or make it part of what's going on all day in that classroom. Because you don't just teach this kind of thing once a day for 15 minutes and expect it to be part of what's internalized by the children. But rather, you have to really work with it all the time and look for opportunities that you have to be able to bring it into the curriculum.
Part of that curriculum, and we were talking about this during our break right here at this studio, and Darlene, I think you were the one who mentioned it, is that there are all different kinds of discrimination. And for the last hour, we focused on discrimination based on color or language. But there's also economic discrimination. Talk to us about that.
Well, there's economic discrimination, and sometimes other types of isms get masked when we're really talking about economics. I also want to add one quick thing, Lee.
Sure.
There are other types of differences that aren't so readily apparent. And I think we need to be sensitive to the fact when we enter into a classroom setting that we really don't know who's out there. So we need to be sensitive to all the types of differences that are out there. Going back to what you were asking me more specifically, I think class differences are quite pervasive. Someone once said to me, sure, Dr. Bailey, you can move to this part of the suburb because you have dollars. People will ignore, people will overlook your color. It's not exactly what I want to hear, okay, obviously, but I think that the price of membership sometimes, particularly in this country, has become money.
Okay. I got a question for you from JFK High School. And the question is, prejudice is often communicated in symbols. Can the panel respond to the message that Chief Wahoo, which is the symbol of the Cleveland Indians, gives young children about the value of all people? Ed Sivak, are you a baseball fan?
Yes, I am.
Okay, you have an opinion on this one?
Yes.
What do you think?
I don't approve of Chief Wahoo because it is it's a symbol. While it might be a cartoon character, some people say it's a negative cartoon character of the Native Americans. How, for one, it's red. Number two, it's the big smile and stuff, and that's not how Native Americans should be portrayed, I feel.
Well, let me ask you, Nikki, are we sending the wrong message to our children about when we wear our baseball caps with the Chief Wahoo symbol?
Yes, I think so, because, I wouldn't want to wake up one morning and see the Nashville Negroes or something on television playing baseball or basketball, or I'm sure nobody would want to see the Colorado Caucasians or something, and I think that's not, I don't think that's, we're giving the right message to the youth of today with the Chief Wahoo symbol.
Well, I think you both put it very well. Let's go to another question. This is also from John F. Kennedy. They got a lot of questions today, and this one I'm not touching with a 10-foot pole, but you have to because you're on the panel, I'm not. This says, does the media fuel hatred between groups? Who wants to handle this one? I get the feeling that you probably do, Billy Osborne. What do you think?
Okay. We'll do it together.
Yes.
Okay, that's all we need to know. Don Friedlander, go ahead, Billy, I'm sorry. Then we'll go to Don.
But I want to be careful in how I answer that. I mean, I was quite precise on that. In some cases, I think that they know that they are doing this, and then there are other cases where I don't think that that's the intent, that there is a very thin line between communicating what's going on in the country, what's news and what's not news. So I think that, yes, we can blame the media.
Don, I think you wanted to answer that too, right?
Well, I was going to say, unintentionally, I think very often messages get transferred of prejudice because of the culture we live in. And I think it's the responsibility of every parent and every teacher to communicate to the child whenever and wherever prejudice is seen. And it even goes back to the very first question that was asked. If you know even a member of your family is prejudiced or has said something in an offhand way about Jews or about blacks, I think a parent has to take every opportunity to bring a message back to that child that that's wrong. It can't be just theoretical. We can read a book about it, we can talk about it generally, but a child needs an object lesson. We've got to use those object lessons to teach.
Can I hit the media piece
Stephanie,
a little
go
bit? Glee, one of the things that I'm always asked about is the whole issue of crime in our communities and who commits crime. And many young African-American people say to me, how come when I turn on the TV all the time and it's a drug bust that it's always a young African-American male? And I'm here to tell you that not only young African-American males sell drugs, but young white males, young Hispanic males, and all other kind of males sell drugs, as well as females. And because people see that in the media, they begin to say, well, it's always that prejudice that I see in the media. And I say that they contribute. I'm not going to put all the blame for whatever goes on in our country on the media, but they can contribute it to prejudice in just that way. And I get that question constantly from young people because that's the imaging that they receive as a result of TV presentations.
Dr. Rue, you have something to say?
I think the blatant example that we saw last year was in South Central LA, where the media really hyped up the hatred, so-called hatred between Korean Americans and blacks in such a way that I think it really they cause a great deal of a community problem.
Dr. Let me interrupt you and ask you a question. You have small children. They're covering the LA riots. Do you have your children watch that on the CNN news or on the nightly news if you think that it is portraying an image that is stereotypical?
I think they tend to sensationalize whatever they can make the dramatize things. Clearly, I remember when they had the Korean Americans with the shotguns and guarding the liquor store, they portrayed as all those people were basically a hooligan type of a presentation. I thought that was a very prejudicial portrayal.
We have a caller from Corpus Christi, Texas. Now that's impressive to me, and his name is Rod. Rod, go ahead, you're on. You're there, Rod. Rod, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Rod, you got 10 more seconds or I'll be totally embarrassed here. Rod? Okay, we'll come back to you, Rod. You can interrupt me anytime. Rod from Corpus Christi's got a bad phone line, but he is there, and he'll be back to us. In the meantime, we're coming back to our studio audience, and I'm going to ask a question. And the question I'm going to ask is to Bill Atwood. And I want to follow up on what David Rue was just talking about, and go back also to something that Stephanie was talking about, and that is violence. Before we broke, we talked about the fact that sometimes a victim of prejudice experiences pain. That pain turns to anger, that anger turns to violence. How do we teach our children to turn this pain into something constructive instead of something violent?
Well, I think one of the things we have to do is give our children alternatives. I think sometimes we see the pain turn to violence because sometimes our children don't feel they have an alternative. If you have a young person that does not have hope for tomorrow, my position is that he's going to turn sometime to violence as an outlet. I think, again, we talked about it before, I think we need to give our children self-esteem. We need to give them options. And in some cases, what I'm seeing and experiencing is that some of our children, even as early as 12 and 13, I saw an article which was very depressing, are talking about preparing for their funeral. When you have a 12 or 13-year-old child talking about, I'm making preparation for my funeral, what hope does that child have?
That's sad. There's some high schools in America that have grieving rooms.
Yeah.
Right?
So we got to give our children hope.
Okay.
If they're going to ventilate some of this pain and get it out of them, they got to have somewhere that's positive to say, well, hey, I can let this go because I have hope over here and I can do certain things and move on.
And that comes back to what a lot of you have been saying about respecting yourself and having self-respect as opposed to self-hate. Am I right, George?
Well, I think it's believing that you have the possibility of participating in naming your world. If you're completely objectified, which is hopelessness, the inability to even conceive a future that's different than the present, then you're not, you know, you're going to turn. You're going to turn on somebody else. Life becomes cheap because your own life is cheap.
Okay. Now let's go to a question from Tri-C East here in Cleveland, Ohio. And the question is, how would you deal with the question of a 4-year-old child who's observed that all people of color only do certain kinds of things? In this case, it says clean or serve at a restaurant. Showing positive role models is an answer, but how does one challenge the numbers? Well, I'm not exactly sure I understand the question, but I guess the bottom line is that if children see people in one kind of way, they begin to stereotype. How do you control that? Myrna, what's your best guess? I know I took you totally off balance, but that's my job, to totally surprise you. Think of this as your 4-year-old child, and she says, Mommy, do all black people clean? Or do all white people play baseball? Or do all Hispanics do something? What do you say?
Well, I would, it goes back to the issue of the media and how media also tends to contribute to that sort of perception, because when you look at television, you also see that as well. I think, again, it goes back to having a conversation with your child and being open enough and, you know, whatever your profession is, whatever that is, it may very well be cleaning, or, you know, but there are some positive attributes to that as well. I think we are putting a lot of the onus on parents, and we also want to remember that parents are also a product of whatever their environment is as well, and that there are parents who have felt that prejudice and have, you know, fought through that system and still hitting that glass ceiling as well. So we have to be supportive of parents as well, and hopefully parents feel good enough about themselves that they can hopefully uplift their child.
Stephanie, you want to say something about this stereotyping?
I think that what's available to everyone is the free public library. And what's in the free public library is access to information that doesn't cost you anything. And if you have a child that's coming to you and saying, do all African Americans clean, take them to the library and let them read all the rich cultures of that nation, or of whatever culture it is. It's right there for them. And teach them to read. If they don't read, show them pictures. It's free. Doesn't cost you anything.
You could go one step further. You go to a library, which I did with my children, where there's a black librarian. And I walked in, because I wanted to show my child, and now we're talking 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I don't think it's as much of a problem today, because you see African Americans in every walk of life.
It must be. That question came from John F. Kennedy School. It must
That's
be a
right.
problem.
I think you have to go intentionally to show that child.
Let me slip over to Darlene first. Darlene, go ahead.
Right. I'm kind of building off of what Don's saying. I understand where the question comes from, and this is where I'm going to put a little pressure on the parent to say, the beauty of the response is reality, that there are folks of all different lifestyles, colors, religions, etc., everywhere. So the parent needs to get out there into some of our professional groups and expose the child that way. Reality affords us the complexity of life so that we can go out, go to the library, we can go everywhere. We can go to the Dentists Association, we can go to a Social Workers Association. We can find people from all different walks of life, all different colors, the two different genders. We haven't gotten that too complicated yet. And we can expose our children to that, but it means that the parent perhaps needs to step out of his or her lifestyle a bit, which may be a little bit insulated at this point, and do that kind of reality research.
Billy, you wanted to say something.
One of the things that we find with most children, particularly at the age of 4, is that normally they all want to be teachers at the beginning, or a police officer, or a fireman, or a mailman.
FBI agent, that's what I wanted, right?
FBI agent. But normally at that age, their expectations of what they can be are high. I mean, the sky is the limit. When I see children who begin to say, are all black people domestic workers or what have you, I question what's really going on. What other environments is this child interacting in that makes him or her feel that a particular race has to stick to a particular profession? Because usually a child's expectations of the future at the age of 4 is, I mean, the sky's the limit. So I think that the parent should begin to look at herself or himself and look at the environment upon which the child is in. If there's no other setting besides the home and the immediate neighborhood, then it's clear that they have to get out of the neighborhood sometime.
I know you all want to say something, but we're going to try high technology one more time. This time, instead of going to Corpus Christi, we're going to go to Martin Luther King. Caller, can you hear me? One more time. Caller, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, I love you. Thank God. Okay. Tell us what your name is and what your question is, even if it's not relevant. I'm glad to hear your voice. Okay, go ahead. What is it?
Okay, my name is Mrs. Peak. I'm calling from the Martin Luther King Law and Public Service Magnet School.
Okay, good.
And our question is, some people are comfortable being racist. What suggestions would members of the panel offer to motivate comfortable racists to change? What does racism cost an individual?
Not an easy question, caller. Who wants to handle that? Any volunteers? If not, 1, 2, 3, I'm going to pick you, and I'm going to pick Darlene.
Thank you, Lee.
Okay. Now, I think the question was, what do you do about people who are very comfortable in their racism?
It's an excellent question, because we all know that the greatest motivator for change is pain. And when there isn't sufficient a level of pain, people get very comfortable. I think what we need to do is to engage in a dialogue about the fact that the pain is there, even though the person may not be personally experiencing it, but that the pain is there. We were talking about this a little earlier in terms of the reciprocity of prejudice, that even the person that makes the discriminatory behavior or act or attribution is cutting him or herself off from embracing all of the goodness that there is to life. Somehow that person needs to be shown that they're happy now, but they could even be more so, that life could even be more enhanced. I don't know if that's grammatically correct, students.
It's all right.
But it could be more greatly enhanced if they allow themselves to venture out, also to talk about that some of the roots of racism are grounded in fear, and to try to engage in a dialogue with that person around what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of losing? What are you afraid of giving up?
Can I approach this a little different way? Because I have experienced one kind of prejudice. I happen to be Jewish. And I remember a time when I was in a room and someone at the microphone said something that I considered to be anti-Semitic. And I must tell you, what disturbed me about the incident was not what the person said. It was that in a room of 300 people there was silence. Not one person got up and challenged that remark. Don't we need to teach our children to challenge the racists? And if we can't convince them to not be racist, at least to speak up and challenge them. What do you think, Ed?
Yeah, I think that's what you need to do. I think the first reaction, especially being still a kid, well, not a kid.
You're not a kid. You're a young man.
Is you want to haul off and hit the person who made the remark.
Right.
But we can't do that. What you need to teach people to do is, sit down, confront the person, but don't confront them in a hostile way. Confront them, that remark, it kind of offended me. I'm Jewish. How come you said that? It's things like that.
Sometimes we don't want to offend somebody, so we don't say anything. Bill, what do you teach the kids at the neighborhood centers?
Okay, I think on a personal level, what I've tried to do is to inform my daughter with certain information, to give her an arsenal, so when she's confronted with prejudice, either directly or indirectly, she can stand up with certain information and deal with it with the person on a one-to-one level. I think, again, I feel that my child or any other child has to have certain information. We talked about their history. I think Mrs. Tubbs talked about their history, cultural experience, and all that. Children need to have certain amount of information. If you're going to deal with something, I think you need to have that type of.
And I think that we have to be careful when we're trying to advise people how to deal in various situations. It depends on the form in which they're in. I mean, I want to say that I don't like to deal with people that are comfortable with racism, but I'm not going to suggest to a child sitting out there that in a forum wherein there are a ton of racists within the room that they jump up and put themselves in peril.
Right.
But they have to learn coping skills in order to be able to deal with that issue, because we have seen what has happened to people who have stood up and then they never stand up again. And not to say that that wasn't a valiant act, but still we don't want to teach our children that we put themselves out there in that peril unless they're joined by another group of people who are going to assist them in some way or teach them the manner in which Ed has spoke to.
Wait one second, Don. Speaking of a child sitting out there, we've got a child sitting out there who has a question. So let's go. Tell us who you are. I recognize you from that film. Weren't you talking about prejudice against Nikes before?
Yes.
I thought I recognized you. Tell us who you are.
I'm Carrie Callahan, a student at Urban Community School. I have a question about how, when you don't like someone that's a different race, religion, shoe, whatever, than you, when does it go into prejudice? When do people take offense, and when does it actually go into real prejudice, hating that?
Carrie, that's an excellent question, because just because you don't like somebody else, it may not be prejudice. Dr. Friedhunt?
It is an excellent question. And Carrie, it is when you don't like that person because they are of a certain race or because they are a certain religion, not because you just don't like their personality or don't like the way that they treat you. You can choose and pick and choose anyone you like to be friends, and it's very important to discriminate. We talked about earlier, when is discrimination good? We make discriminations in our lives. We like certain kinds of paintings. We like certain kinds of plays. We all make these discriminations. But when it involves a whole class of people, just because they are black or just because they happen to be of a certain religion, that's when it's prejudice.
Now that's what the psychologist says. Let's see what the psychiatrist says. What do you say? Okay.
Basically, Tiro. And I think Don was talking about this discriminating power is part of what keeps us going. We make decisions all the time, but the basis on just because someone wears Nike shoes, you just don't play with a person at all. That's been carried away a little bit, don't you think?
Well, I'll tell you what. I think as the little man in my ears telling me we have got only time for one more person, and Sally, one time I could tell you wanted to say something unless I misunderstood. And if you don't have anything to say, you got to say something now because I just called on you. So what do you want to say?
Well, you're very perceptive.
Sum it up.
Sum it up.
Sum it up, because this is the last 2 minutes before we go and do a close, and you should tell us what do we learned today, because you're a teacher of teachers. I can't think of anybody better to close on.
Well, I think we probably all learned different things, but hopefully we'll all leave this experience, and that's what it was, no matter where we were sitting, with the idea that one person can make a difference, and that if we all take it upon ourselves to really set a goal, to try to do something in whatever way we can affect some change, that maybe in our own way we can see prejudice, racism, discrimination, whatever, not fully eradicated, but we can see change occur, and we can give hope to all of us, and that's what will keep all of us working at it.
Well, that is what we've been talking about today. Hope, aspirations for children, turning pain into something constructive. A lot of what we've discussed is really about attitude. Is it possible to change attitudes about prejudice? Let's listen to Dr. Robert Coles.
What is it that separates us from others? Why are these barriers constructed? How sad those barriers are, and how important it is for all of us to work to break those barriers down so that we can all reach out to one another as fellow human beings. This is our final identity. We are human beings here for a short time. We come from nowhere, so to speak, and we ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And the short time we have on this earth ought to be given toward human understanding and toward love for our fellow human beings. And when that love is destroyed by prejudice and hate, then we're all the victims of such a lapse in our humanity.
Thank you, Dr. Coles. We're continuously involved and reminded of the joys of gaining the skills and confidence to live in the richness of our diverse society. I hope that this program has provided you with support for your own efforts as you respond to the challenges of the People Puzzle as presented in this teleconference. Please come to the People Puzzle at the Cleveland Children's Museum. This exhibit is a joint project of the National Conference of Christians and Jews and of the museum. There are many ways to go and many resources available. Let us know how we can help you. The tapes of this teleconference can be ordered from the Cleveland Children's Museum, 107030 Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, 44106, or you can call them at 216-791-7114. That's for Rod in Corpus Christi. We never got to you, Rod, so get that number. Or the National Conference of Christians and Jews at 3645 Warrensville Center Road, Suite 221 in Shaker Heights, 44122. Rod, listen to the number again, 216-752-3000. The cost is $10 per tape, except for Rod, it's for free for him. Additional resource material on prejudice reduction is available from both organizations. As members of the human family, let's pledge to work together as we complete this people puzzle. This is Lee Fisher. Goodbye, and thanks for joining us.